Hello, welcome back to the channel with a new one today, because I've been making thoughts or having some thoughts about how exactly we've been teaching people to learn the game of golf, and whether maybe we're doing it wrongly, or maybe there's an alternative way. By sometimes just taking things, stripping things back to basics, you can actually start to help golfers far more quickly by getting out of old regimented theories and old regimented ways of teaching people to learn golf. So today I want to do a little bit of a kind of a, well, I suppose, test it on you guys and see whether this is going to help any of you to get a better understanding of what a golf swing is. What I've been thinking about really is, rather than starting as we usually do with the address position and the grip and all of these things, what we're going to do is basically start with the golf club. Get the golfer to have a better understanding of how to move the golf club and what is moving the golf club. And I believe the first thing is basically to get the golf club simply swinging around an axis, to get the golfer, the beginner, to understand how a golf swing or a golf club swings around an axis. The first thing to understand is it's basically just a stick with a weight on the end of it, and the weight isn't even centered. It's not the same on both sides of the stick. It's hanging with more weight slightly away from the stick, and therefore if you're going to let it hang, it won't actually hang absolutely vertically to the ground. It will hang so that the toe is on the ground. But if you were to allow it to hang like that, then just allowing gravity to work on it will bring that toe back to the ground every time. If, however, you start the same thing and lie the club flat on the ground, the club will not try and get back to where it was. If this axis doesn't move, it will simply try and get back underneath the axis. The toe will then come into the ground and you won't get back to the starting position. You could basically say this is the main problem for beginners. They develop a phobia about the ground very early on in their education, simply because of this. Now you can help this a little bit with your grip. If you grip the club correctly with the ball of your lead hand on top of the club, that will stop to a certain extent this drooping, this fight of gravity to get the club vertical to the ground again. But only if you allow the wrist to go into what we call ulnar deviation. That means to be bent down. And when I now swing the club, and I've done this for you before, you can now see that if I start in ulnar deviation totally, so bent down, forward down as I can, then I can let the club swing around my wrist joint, and the same thing will happen as before. The club will come back to its starting position by itself, as long as I keep the wrist joint in a stable position opposite more or less the point on the ground that I want to hit. This, however, is a very complicated movement for the wrist joint, although it seems simple here. I am actually rotating the wrist joint with the help of my lower arm while hinging the wrist joint up. And even the flexion in the hand, or here extension in the hand, moves into flexion as I take the club back before going out and back into extension through the ball. All of these things, however, I can actually allow to happen just by using the forces of gravity. When I place the trail hand on the club, the trail hand does tend to want to dominate this movement, but the trail hand will move similarly to the lead hand, allowing the club simply to swing backwards and forwards As long as I start with the hands totally bent down into ulnar deviation, the club should come back where it started from every time, even to the point where without any body movement or very little, I can basically flip a ball away. Now I know you're all out there saying, well, you shouldn't really be flipping it, Jonathan, you've got to get compression on it. But we're going to get there. The next step is to get them to understand that if you start then to turn, you won't get back to the ball. Why? Because if you have all of this ulnar deviation and you start to move the club forward, so moving the grip end forward, you are delaying the release of your wrists and therefore moving the low point in the swing forward and past the ball, which simply means if you start in this position, you're going to swing over the ball. Even though you're letting it release, the club is coming to the ground after the ball and you're just going to top it. So to stop topping it, if you're going to start to turn, you've got to get rid of some of this ulnar deviation in the address position, which means you're going to have to tilt your body forward so that you can get your hands down. If you do it too little and turn, you're going to hit the ground after the ball. If you do it too much and turn insufficiently, you're going to hit the ground before the ball. So now you're creating two different forces, the force of the club being pulled down by gravity and the force of the hands being pulled forward by your rotation. This is going to be the balancing act for the whole of your golfing life. Can you actually balance the releasing of your wrist angle in the downswing with the turning of your body towards the target in order to control the low point in the swing relative to the golf ball? If you can do that, then irrespective of how you want to hit the ball, in the downswing or in the upswing, you're always going to be able to hit the ball correctly irrespective of the club that you're using. What you have to understand is how important this ulnar or radial deviation is in the address position. And the more that you have, the more you have to turn. So if I'm talking out there to somebody who's been playing the game for a long time and has always hit into the ground, have a look at your address position. Are you in too much spine angle with your hands too low and incapable of getting enough rotation to get your hands ahead of the ball, and therefore you're always going to hit into the ground simply because of the physics of it? Simply by standing a bit more upright and getting your hands into a higher position in the address position, you will be able to remedy that and stop hitting into the ground as much. No, you won't be able to get as much pressure on the ball. Pressure on the ball or hitting the ball in the downswing is obviously dependent on the change here in the ulnar and radial deviation. If the deepest point for my swing arc is behind or towards the target and in the ground, then obviously I'm going to compress the ball more than if the deepest point is directly under the ball and the club is basically just brushing the grass lightly before going directly after the ball back up into the air, because it's simply the bottom of the pendulum movement that you're making. I hope this is all making sense to you, but if you can start to get the feeling of how the club moves around your wrist joint and then control the angles here between the shaft and your hand, you will realize that the more or greater the angle gets here, the more you have to move your hands forward, and therefore the more you're going to have to rotate, because we can't just swing our arms backwards and forwards to move the hands towards the target. We have to rotate the body so that the arms are being pulled around, and as they're being pulled around the body, they are moving the low point in the swing automatically. Controlling this low point for a beginner is the most important thing to get used to. Once you have actually got that, then the next lesson is going to have to be about how to move the club up and down on what we call the plane, which means once you've decided on the angle that you want to have here, then allowing the club to carry on to move in this angle and therefore keep the ball in the way. If the angle is not correct, you're getting too steep, the club will come back too close to you. If you're getting too flat, obviously it will want to come back over the ball. So keeping it on the angle would be the next step really in the beginner's lesson. I'm very interested to hear what you think about this. Is it rubbish? Is it going to get people, make it more complicated for people to learn? Or is this maybe where we should have been starting all along? A simple understanding of moving this stick up and down around an axis which is not to start off with up here, but down here in your wrist area. Understanding how your wrists are moving when you're moving this golf club and allowing them to do it. And then understanding how you can control the deep point in the swing, the low point in the swing, and therefore get back to the ball every time. Once you can do that, you can actually start to then build in more dynamic body and arm movements in order to accelerate the golf club. But the very first thing I believe you should be looking at is, how do I swing the golf club around my wrists? What do I have to take into account when I'm doing this? Was it any good? If it was, then give me a like. If it wasn't, then don't. Subscribe to the channel anyway, because who knows, the next one might be better. And if you would like to support me and everything I'm doing to try and make you all better golfers, then maybe you'd like to become a patron to the channel. I shall leave a link below, and a big thanks as ever to the patrons to the channel at the moment. See you next time.